Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This is the show where we dive into your sources, pull out the core insights, and we'll give you that shortcut to really knowing what's going on. Today, we're tackling something that might just fundamentally shift how you see the world. Seriously, how you see truth, information, even your everyday conversations. We're talking about Michel Foucault and his, well, incredibly influential idea of power knowledge.
It really is a concept that challenges our basic assumptions. I mean, most of us think of power as, control, maybe force, and knowledge is just understanding facts. But Foucault, he argued they're so deeply woven together, you basically can't have one without the other. It's quite revolutionary, but it also helps explain an awful lot.
Okay, let's definitely unpack this. Our mission today is to get a real handle on Foucault's power knowledge framework. We're going to look at how it changes our view of things like universities, how the state operates, and how it shows up right now in our digital lives. We've got a great stack of sources, some critical analysis of Foucault and higher ed research, a comparison with Max Weber on the state, and several deep dives into the power knowledge idea itself. So get ready for maybe a few aha moments. So let's start right there. The core idea. When Foucault put power and knowledge together, joined them up like that, what exactly was he getting at? How are they inextricably linked?
Well, what's really groundbreaking, I think, is Foucault saying that knowledge isn't just out there. It's not neutral. It's always produced within this huge web, this system of power relationships. I mean, think about it. Scientific knowledge, for example, where does it come from? Usually well-funded places, right? Universities, corporations, governments. And all these places are, as one source puts it, rife with their own visible and often invisible power relations. And these relationships, they're the ones deciding what research gets the green light, what types of utterances and viewpoints are accepted, and maybe more importantly, which viewpoints, utterances, and research agendas are included in or excluded from what we even call truth or knowledge in a certain field.
Right. So the knowledge isn't just discovered, it's actively shaped by who has the influence, what their interests are. What we call truth is often tangled up with power, but, and this is key, I think, it's not just the obvious stuff like a king telling everyone what to think. It's not always top-down control, is it? Can you give an example of how it's maybe more subtle?
Absolutely not just top-down. That's crucial. Foucault really stresses that power relationships, they can flow, bottom-up, lateral, overlapping, or even bidirectional. Think about a typical university department. Sure, a professor has power over students' grades, recommendations, that sort of thing, but students also have some power, right? Evaluations, maybe appeals processes. But go beyond that. Think about the lateral power between students in the same group, maybe, or among faculty members themselves, or between faculty and administrators. These social dynamics, they really influence whose work is praised or ridiculed, which students are taken seriously, or, which faculty members get their research proposals accepted. So it means basically every time you encounter information or you try to influence something, you're stepping into this really complex web where power and knowledge are constantly shaping each other.
That really changes how you think about places like universities. You tend to imagine them as these pure zones of knowledge seeking, but Foucault's saying maybe not so much. So let's dig into that. How does this power-knowledge dynamic actually work inside academic institutions, these supposed centers of creating knowledge?
Yeah, if you connect this to the bigger picture, Foucault's whole way of thinking, it challenges the very bedrock of traditional perspectives on knowledge production in higher education. Knowledge, then, can't really be seen as this impartial pursuit divorced from the power dynamics inherent in institutional structures. The university isn't neutral ground. It's like a landscape sculpted by the contours of power relations.
You're basically saying there's no escaping it, even in academia. What gets studied, what gets taught, it's all influenced by who holds the cards, maybe who has the funding. Can you give us some really concrete examples? How do specific fields or just the way universities run become these sites of power?
Definitely. We see it in a few key areas. First off, disciplinary formations. Academic subjects like history, biology, economics. Foucault argued these aren't just neutral boxes for facts. They actively shape and regulate what counts as legitimate knowledge within that field. And this can kind of lead to a standardization of scholarly understanding, maybe a reduction in views. It might even make it harder for, say, interdisciplinary stuff to get traction if it doesn't fit the established mold.
Okay, so the discipline itself sets the rules. What about the practical stuff, like getting published or getting research grants?
Right. That brings us to institutional practices. Things like peer review processes and funding allocations. These are really crucial sites of power. Academic journals, funding bodies, they act as gatekeepers, don't they? They influence which research is deemed worthy of publication, funding, or institutional support.
Yeah.
And there's a worry, mentioned in the sources, that peer review might sometimes strengthen established paradigms, maybe show preference for specific methodologies, and potentially even suppress dissenting or alternative viewpoints.
And does that then circle back and affect academic freedom if everyone's sort of chasing the same approved topics or methods?
That's a big concern, yeah. Academic freedom. If you start seeing all knowledge as an expression of power relations, some worry it could curb academic freedom. Scholars might find themselves trying to balance their pursuit of truth with the influential factors that affect academic research. The idea of the scholar as just an independent truth seeker. It gets more complicated. They're seen as embedded in an intricate network of power dynamics.
Wow. So it's not just what gets published, it's even what gets taught in the first place.
Absolutely. The curriculum itself, what gets labeled valid knowledge in the classroom, it can be, as one source puts it, overdetermined by class interests and might serve to reproduce the legitimacy of the existing social order.
Yeah.
And we need to look past just the formal stuff, the textbooks, the lectures. There's also the hidden curriculum.
The hidden curriculum, what's that?
It's all the unstated norms, values, and beliefs that get transmitted. So history textbooks might present certain heroes to be emulated or certain ideals to be striven for. They convey these subtle messages about what's right and wrong, important or unimportant. And interestingly, one source suggests the hidden curriculum is only hidden, if at all, to the teacher. It is clearly visible to the students. They pick up on those unstated rules.
And stepping back even more, the state itself must have a role in this, right? Especially in public education.
Oh, absolutely. That's state control of education. Provincial governments, for instance, have significant legal and financial control over the public school curriculum. This means curriculum guidelines, rights of approval over new courses, textbooks, even things like teacher certification, which then strongly influences the content of teacher training. All this control, it kind of arbitrarily limits the definition and scope of classroom knowledge. So what you learned in school, topics, how they were framed, deeply influenced by these larger power structures. And moving beyond just schools, Foucault's ideas give us a really powerful way to critique how the state itself holds on to authority. You know, Max Weber, a huge figure in sociology, he defined the state partly by its monopoly on legitimate violence within a territory. He talked about three types of authority. There's traditional authority based on custom, like, crowning a king or queen. Then charismatic leadership, where people follow a leader because of their personal qualities. And rational legal authority based on rules, laws, systems. But Foucault comes along and says, wait a second, states don't just use force, they use knowledge to maintain and even increase control through a process he called normalization.
Okay, hold on. So the state isn't just police and laws, it's also about shaping what we know, how we think, using information itself as a tool. Tell us more about this reason of the state and normalization.
Precisely. Foucault talks about raison d'etat, the reason of the state. But it's not some mystical guiding principle. It's more like a practical rationality. It's the range of choices and actions available to officials, shaped by past decisions and the state's structure, all aimed at protecting the state's interests. You can see this historically, like how states shifted their economic thinking. Take mercantilism, heavy state control over things like food prices and trade. It often led to big economic swings, unrest. So leaders eventually adopted liberalism. They let people set prices, hoard grain, trade freely. This laissez-faire approach wasn't just about economics. It was a technique, Foucault would argue, to ensure the population will remain politically docile while economically active. Prevent riots by changing the accepted knowledge about how the economy should work.
Right, so shifting the common sense way of doing things becomes a form of control. Less overt force needed. And normalization. How does that fit in?
Normalization is key. It's the process where the state manages to link its law with what people consider to be normal. This really bolsters its security. By making laws that reflect or even shape what's seen as normal, acceptable behavior, the state kind of shores itself up against potential uprisings. It feels natural to follow the law because the law reflects normal, and it's not just the government doing this directly. Think about institutions like prisons, workplaces, schools, and hospitals. They might seem apolitical on the surface. But Foucault says they're actually deeply political. They play a role in disciplining individuals to fit norms. And they gather incredibly detailed information about people, especially those who deviate. This gives the state a kind of intellectual form of authority. It knows its population in detail. Think about, say, public health campaigns. They don't just give advice, they subtly define what a normal, healthy citizen does, creating norms that are hard to step outside of.
Wow. It really does sound like this power-knowledge dynamic seeps into almost everything, not just the big institutions, but our daily lives, maybe even how we see ourselves.
Yeah.
How does this work in more subtle ways, especially now, in our super digital world?
Yeah, Foucault's idea of power is that it operates in these intricate and subtle ways, much more than just obvious force. It's described as a diffuse and circulating force exercised through this whole network of social relationships. It permeates all aspects of society. And a really key mechanism for this is discourse.
Discourse, what does that mean exactly?
Discourse refers to the sort of socially sanctioned ways of constituting knowledge, subjectivities, and power relations. Basically, it's how our language, the stories we tell, the accepted ways of talking about things actually create our reality. What we see as truth, morality, and meaning, these are created through discourse. And these discourses aren't just talk, they have distinctly material effects. They lead to practices that systematically form the objects of which they speak.
Okay, let me try to rephrase. So, discourse is like the framework of language and accepted ideas that shapes what we even think is possible or true. And that framework has real-world consequences.
Exactly. And when you look at the digital age, Foucault's ideas are incredibly relevant. For instance, disciplinary power. Remember, that's about surveillance and normalization. Well, it's everywhere online. Think data collection, algorithmic surveillance, online profiling. These tools categorize us, predict our behavior, influence the choices presented to us. Every targeted ad, every recommended video, that's disciplinary power using knowledge about you.
Like the algorithm knowing what I want.
Right. Then there's biopower. This extends to managing our digital identities, online personas, virtual selves. Social media lets us curate who we are online, but it also puts us under constant scrutiny, surveillance, and discipline. Think about the pressure to present a certain image or fitness trackers managing your body data. That's biopower in the digital realm.
Okay, I see that. And information itself.
That's the politics of information. Digital tech has totally changed how knowledge is produced and shared. Platforms like Wikipedia or social media empower individuals in some ways, but they also create new forms of censorship, misinformation, and manipulation. Because powerful algorithms control the flow, shaping what you see and what you don't, your reality is curated.
Yeah, the filter bubble effect.
Exactly. And finally, governmentality. This is where digital tools like data analytics, predictive modeling, and behavioral nudging are used by governments, but also corporations, to subtly influence and manipulate individuals' behaviors and choices online. Think about those little nudges websites use to get you to sign up, or how data analysis might shape public policy. So yeah, your social media feed, your search history, maybe even your health records. It's all part of this incredibly complex, often subtle power knowledge web.
There. Okay. If this power knowledge thing is so pervasive, so subtle, woven into everything, what does that mean for us? Is resistance even possible? Can we actually challenge these dominant systems if the very way we understand reality is shaped by them? It feels a bit like we're trapped in the matrix sometimes.
Well, Foucault himself famously said, resistance exists wherever power is present. So the possibility is always there. Yes, resistance is possible. We see it when scholars challenge established ideas or when activists amplify marginalized viewpoints or critique how institutions work. Often, this resistance takes the form of counter-discourses. These are alternative ways of speaking, thinking, and understanding that directly challenge dominant power structures and propose new forms of knowledge. Think about the feminist movement, for example. By creating and promoting concepts like gender equality or toxic masculinity, they develop powerful counter-discourses that have genuinely reshaped public conversation and pushed for social change. It's about creating a different story, a different way to see things.
Okay, that's definitely more hopeful. Creating new ways to talk about things.
Yeah.
But are there limits or challenges to making that resistance stick? It feels like fighting smoke sometimes.
That's a really important point. There are definitely challenges. Critics like Charles Taylor have asked, to what extent can individuals really genuinely disentangle themselves from power systems that are just so deeply embedded? There's also a criticism that Foucault's framework, while great at analyzing power, maybe fails to offer specific instructions on how to give a voice to underrepresented groups or combat structural inequality. It describes a problem, but maybe not the solution. And resistance, if it doesn't have a clear sort of ethical or normative grounding, it could risk becoming just, a reactionary power. Or worse, it could even be co-opted and assimilated by the very power structures it's trying to fight, like a company adopting diversity language, but not actually changing anything fundamental about its power structure.
Right. The challenge is making resistance meaningful and lasting.
Exactly. So the challenge, maybe for you listening, is to think about how you can actively challenge the dominant stories or even create your own counter-discourse within this complex interplay of power and knowledge.
And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into Michel Foucault's concept of power knowledge. We've really unpacked how this linked pair, power and knowledge, shapes what we accept as true, who gets to speak, how our universities work, how the state functions, and even those subtle influences in our digital lives. It's a really profound way to look at the world. Makes you see how much of what feels normal or true is actually, well, constructed.
Absolutely. By really getting how power and knowledge are tangled up, we start to see more clearly how they shape our social structures, our daily practices, even our own experiences. Knowledge really becomes powerful when we understand how it's produced and used,
Yeah.
and critical thinking is just essential for navigating all the information and influence swirling around us.
So here's something to chew on as you go about your day. If all knowledge is tied up with power, and power isn't just top-down but flows everywhere, how does consciously making an effort to seek out different voices, maybe marginalized perspectives, become more than just learning? Does it become an active agency, a way of pushing back within that power knowledge web itself? What stories are you taking for granted? And what might happen if you started to question them? Something to mull over until our next deep dive.